Back to Steamboat Springs, our good friend Mary Kissel and our tremendous Liberties Nemesis panel.
Wake up, America. Tomorrow becomes a new day. And everything you do matters. Yeah, everything you do matters in some way.
I told the panelists not to turn their mics on until they got up on stage because we don't want to have a flexibility moment. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for that lovely, lovely introduction. It is a great honor, a pleasure, really a privilege to be here with you. I don't know if we're going to get this taken off the stage. Can you all see us here in the middle? No? But can you hear us? Yes, excellent. What Jennifer didn't mention is last year I had the privilege of also interviewing General Michael Flynn on this stage. So of the three men here in the audience, if you've met the Russian ambassador recently, now is the time to tell me.
I might have, but I didn't know it at the time.
Well,
I haven't, but my client has.
oh boy, Dean.
No comment.
Okay. Well, I'd like to just start off by, again, just paying tribute to what Jennifer and Rick have built. This is a very important institution, and I think as you've divined, if this is your first time at Steamboat, it's quite a fun one too. And it's also a relief to be able to talk about things like freedom and liberty and Donald Trump in a way that you don't really get to do if you're in your workplace or if you're in the middle of Manhattan, as James Taranto and I are, and Jillian as well. So really glad that you've come, especially if you're first-timers. I'll start by introducing the panel, starting from the far end. John Yoo is the co-director of the Korea Law Center at the UC Berkeley Law School and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He clerked for Judge Clarence Thomas. He was general counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, deputy assistant AG in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice in the George W. Bush administration. John and his colleagues are responsible for creating the legal infrastructure for the war on terror, the legal infrastructure which has kept us safe for 16 years now. We owe great debt to him. He's the author of many books, including Liberty's Nemesis. To his left is Dean Reuter, General Counsel, VP, Director of Practice Group at the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy. Again, a very important institution in America today, spreading conservative principles and ideas at, I think, more than 200 law schools now. Is that right, Dean?
That's right.
Across the country?
Every accredited law school and then some.
Every accredited law school and then some, including where I guess our Treasury Secretary's wife went to law school. Sorry if you didn't get that joke. I'm glad you didn't. He's also the editor of Liberty's Nemesis and is currently writing another book about World War II. And then to my immediate right is Charles Chuck Cooper, founding member and chairman of Cooper and Kirk, prominent law firm in Washington, D.C. He clerked for Judge Paul Roney of the Fifth Circuit, as well as for Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist. He served as Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel during the Ronald Reagan administration. It's quite a distinguished panel. Well, I've always thought that hell was other people, but as I've learned from Liberty's Nemesis, it is actually the bureaucracy. And as James Taranto outlined for us during his speech so well, we've seen it very vividly over the last several years. The IRS targeting conservative groups, the CFPB shaking down financial institutions, the EPA targeting coal producers, the Department of Justice setting up kangaroo courts in our educational system on college campuses. The feds can now penalize you for not buying a product of health care. And what John and Dean have done in their book is they've brought together some of the nation's most prominent thinkers, academics, jurists, business people, a current cabinet member, former cabinet officials, to explain what the administrative state is, how it's run so far out of control, and what we can do about it. And so that's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to make panels on bureaucracy great again. So I propose to set up this panel in 3 parts because I'd like you to learn something and to have some takeaways. First thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the administrative state is and give you some stats on how large it is. Then we're going to try to educate you a little bit as to how it's changed and why, and then we'll try to give you some examples of that and what we should do about it. And this will be an interactive discussion, and hopefully we'll get into some good arguments. So John, I'm going to start with you. Can you just define the term for us of what it is that we're discussing today? What is the administrative state as you understand it?
Well, first I want to say thank you so much to Mary for chairing this. Mary, to me, my generation, I think of her as the 21st century version of Mary Tyler Moore. Look at the great, the haircut. But Mary Tyler Moore in favor of free markets.
I'll take it.
Toss your hair.
It's so great to be here. Chuck he's a very modest fellow, and you should know Chuck is one of the great Supreme Court advocates of his generation and regularly argues many cases in the court. He is famous for winning I believe, a $10 billion judgment against the United States government for seizing property, essentially, reputation from our nation's banks. I teach the case in school all the time. And I just want to say Dean is one of the people who runs, I think, one of the most influential conservative groups in the country. Although Neil Gorsuch had the fortune of being born in Colorado, that in itself does not get you on the Supreme Court. And I think if it were not for the Federalist Society, not only would Justice Gorsuch not be on the court, but you wouldn't see all the great lower court judges that President Trump is appointing right now and that President Bush appointed before him. So we have a lot to thank the Federalist Society. Dean's been there almost from the very beginning, helping them in this work. It's incredible. When I went to law school, we had a Federalist Society chapter for conservatives, and when I went to the first meeting, out of a school of 500 students, there were 9 people. And nowadays, I would say probably it's so successful, there are 10 people. But I went to Yale, so. Okay, enough jokes, but I got a lot more of them for dinner. First, the administrative state, it's very hard to get our arms around it because it is a sprawling, amorphous, ever-growing mass. And one of the things where it has gotten out of control. It's very hard to define. You can think of it as the fourth branch of government. Our framers were smart men, and they decided a fairly modest federal government. There were only 4 cabinet departments in the beginning, the ones that we really need. State, Defense, but back in the good old days, they used to call it what it was, the Department of War, the Attorney General for law enforcement, and Treasury. And that was pretty much it. If you look at Lincoln's cabinet, it's still the same 4 cabinet officers. Today, Dean's the expert, I bet no one can guess how many agencies there are in the federal government. Also, our government used to be really small. The head at the time of the framing of the biggest federal agency was Alexander Hamilton, who's suddenly cool because apparently he can rap now. Hamilton led the biggest part of the federal government. It only had 300 people who were mostly just customs inspectors at our nation's ports. And the budget, I think, for the whole federal government was no more than $2 million. Today, I don't think anyone in Washington actually knows how many people work for the federal government, how many agencies are, and how much money it spends. We know how much money we give it, but I'm sure they're spending much more than what they take in taxes. But the last thing, and this is where our framers were, I think, most visionary and were most different. They designed a constitution where the executive branch and the agencies, their main job was just to implement the law that Congress passed. Congress was supposed to be the main developer of public policy. The president was supposed to be secondary. Today, we live in a world where Congress, as I'm sure we're going to hear, rarely passes laws of major significance. The agencies have taken over the function of making most of the laws that you and I interact with on a daily basis. None of us ever voted for them. None of us can fire them. None of us can decide who gets promoted. So they become a branch that exercises the great bulk of power in our country and are really unaccountable in the way the framers intended our more modest federal government to work.
Dean, when you start the book in the introduction, just to add to John's comments, you talk about horizontal checks and vertical checks. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. This goes back to what John was saying about the separation of powers in the federal government. In the first instance, we gave the federal government, the founders that is, gave the federal government very limited powers. That was on purpose because they thought the accumulation and concentration of powers leads to tyranny, and they were right, of course. So we begin with a limited grant of government, a limited grant of power to the federal government, but then they ingeniously separated the power so that no one person or no one entity or no few groups of individuals could hold outsized powers. So the vertical separation of powers really is the people, the state, the federal government. The horizontal separation of powers is between the branches of government, the three branches of government. John alluded to the fourth branch of government, which I think has become a reality. And we can talk about how we got to the fourth branch of government.
Yeah, let's start there, because John, just from your comments, it sounds as if there was some kind of envisioning of a sort of administrative state at the founding. It wasn't as if this was something that just grew out of whole cloth. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's like a cancer, I hate to say it. There was the idea of healthy organs that were going to perform a certain modest function. And like a cancer, the administrative state has just grown out of control in a way that we didn't intend. But one way to think of it is those four basic agencies back in 1789 that are still there at 1865 and really pretty much there until the turn of the century are to execute the laws that Congress passed. And that's the primary domestic role of the president, is to execute the laws. And so that's perfectly constitutional. You couldn't have a government where God forbid, Congress was enforcing the laws, right? So the framers knew that you had to keep separate lawmaking in Congress and law enforcement, which was supposed to be in the executive branch, and they would check each other. The thing that changed, and if there's one person who's really at fault, it's not Barack Obama, which is usually the right answer, but it's not. Although Obama really put the administrative state on steroids. I mean, he really took it farther, but it was really Woodrow Wilson and then Franklin Roosevelt. And their idea was the framers made it too hard to make laws. That's what our framers wanted. That's why we have a House and a Senate and a veto. It's supposed to be hard to make a law. Woodrow Wilson and FDR said, oh, it's a modern society. They both ran on the platform that the Constitution was obsolete. And they said, we need to copy, guess who? Germany, where it's easy to pass laws. So what they did is they transferred all the lawmaking authority to the agencies. They love it. Congress loves it because we don't hold them accountable anymore for mistakes. They blame whenever anything goes bad, who do they blame? Those unaccountable bureaucrats. But they never tell you, well, we fund them and we created them. So to give you a great last example, and I'll shut up, is the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act, right, you would think you can make an argument whether Congress should even be regulating the air, as Dean mentioned, right? Why don't states regulate the air? That's what our framers probably wanted to do. But when Congress passed the Clean Air Act, I would just like, as someone who comes from the lowlands in San Francisco, I would just like there to be more air, especially up here. Because I seem to be lacking it right now. But all Congress did is they passed a statute saying the EPA shall be given the authority to make the air clean. End of statute. And then the EPA shall have all the power to make all the regulations to get us to clean air, balancing industrial needs and so on, health and safety. Think how much that transfers almost all the power of the Congress to that agency. But you and I cannot hold them accountable. We can't vote them into office and vote them out of office. Presidents have a hard time controlling them because there's so many of them. And as you see, agency heads often are at odds with presidents. So it becomes very difficult to control this big morass, even that started from these very modest beginnings 200 years ago.
Yeah, you have a wonderful quote, just to drag us back to the narrative. We've defined the administrative state. Now we're going to explain to you how it came to be. There's a wonderful quote in the book about President Wilson where Dean and John write, well before his presidency, Wilson began articulating a view of government administration echoed today among both Democrats and Republicans, the need to run government like a business. Was that found familiar? Just wanted to put that out there.
Can I follow up on one thing that John said?
Please.
I think it's important to take note of the fact that this is all done on purpose. And the whole theory of the Constitution was to separate and segregate power so nobody had outsized power. And Woodrow Wilson set this up so that those people would have power and they would be outside the political system. I think that's a key to understanding the way the world is working today.
But, please.
If I could just add, and unaccountable power, as John has suggested, but not just unaccountable in the sense that they've been given lawmaking power, essentially unconstrained lawmaking power by Congress. But it was Woodrow Wilson's great idea to also separate them from presidential control by creating the so-called independent agencies whose heads, either multi-member or single-member, an issue currently roiling the courts, but whose heads could not be removed by the president except for, quote, cause. And so that has essentially created an administrative state that is, in effect, a one-branch government unto itself.
But Chuck, aren't the courts also at fault? I mean, let's talk about some of the major precedents here. Wickard v. Filburn, something that I don't know if the audience is familiar with. I know many of you actually are constitutional scholars. But why was that case so important, and how did that add to this unaccountability that John and Dean have outlined?
Well, that is one of many cases that I think one could blame for the state of affairs today. But Wickard against Filburn was a Commerce Clause case where the Congress and the administrative agencies were literally regulating the sale, the consumption of wheat grown by the farmer for use at his own dinner table. The commerce power, which is a legitimate power that Congress has and needs to have to regulate interstate commerce, was broadened and extended by the
court.
First by the Congress and the executive agencies implementing New Deal legislation, and then by the courts to bless this kind of extraordinary extension of congressional commerce power to include such a thing as that. That was the essential basis on which Congress then later relied in Obamacare to ultimately say that everyone in this room could be ordered by Congress under the so-called individual mandate to buy health care that you didn't want, didn't think you need, if in fact that was your position. An unprecedented extension of congressional power, unfortunately upheld by the Supreme Court 5-4. So yes, Wickard was a predicate and a pivot for extraordinary extensions of federal power into the domains of the states and individuals.
Yeah, I think the court's reasoning there was amusing and worth sketching out just very briefly. They got to the idea that interstate commerce was affected by this farmer who was growing wheat on his own farm, consuming it on his own farm, because in doing that, he was not putting it into the interstate market. So that's how they got to the idea that there was congressional authority to do this. So,
hip bone connected to the thigh bone. And under that theory,
we're back to
it
healthcare.
is no exaggeration to say that there is nothing within the Congressional Commerce Clause power. As many scholars, like the scholars here on my panel with me, have pointed out. And it's absolutely true. If that's the extent of Congress's Commerce Clause power, then Congress has exactly what the framers specifically denied it, a general police power. They enumerated the powers carefully that Congress had, including the power to regulate interstate commerce, but genuinely interstate commerce, not the growth of wheat or any other substance, for those of you in Colorado, for consumption at your own table within your own home.
I thought it was lack of oxygen that I felt this way, but actually it's secondhand smoke.
I just want to stay on the issue of the courts, because clearly Wilson and the progressives kicked this off. Wilson and then FDR. The courts aided it. But the courts have also really deferred to the administrative state. And one of the issues that you take up a lot in the book is the issue of what's called Chevron Deference. Dean, can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and why it
Sure.
matters?
Sure. We've sort of described Congress's role in this in delegating all the power to the agencies. We're switching about the court's role in allowing the agencies to act. There's this case from the early 1970s, and basically it sets out the notion that if Congress has delegated authority to legislative authority even to the agencies, and the agencies are interpreting that and applying that authority, meaning they're making laws, really, in my opinion, that we, the courts, are going to defer to the decisions and the findings of the agency. We're not going to second-guess the agency. We're going to sort of presume there's a regularity in this transaction, this transmission of power from Congress to the agencies, and then in the exercise of the agency's power. So it's really pernicious, and it sort of spreads the blame for the establishment.
And wasn't Scalia involved in that case, Chuck?
He was, and Justice Scalia, may he rest in peace, was a big proponent of Chevron when it came into existence in the 1980s. And it was essentially designed to take power out of the hands of the courts, who at the time, particularly in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which was populated by a number of, very liberal judges, who would interpret federal laws in the most extraordinarily broad and liberal ways and freeze those laws in place. And the thinking at the time was that, well, if the courts have to defer to the agencies, then a succeeding agency can change its mind, and the courts will have to defer to that as well. In the fullness of time, though, Justice Scalia came around to question seriously whether Chevron was, number one, a good idea, and it really plainly isn't at this stage, we can say. But number two, whether it's genuinely constitutional, and at least in my opinion, it clearly isn't. And if I could just add that Chevron has special meaning for me. Professor Yu here and Dean Reuter are renowned scholars of the administrative state. They study it day in and day out. Professor Yu teaches the subject, writes about it widely. Me, I just sue these agencies.
You've got the better job.
And God help me, I love it so. But Chevron is obviously, for those of us who litigate against the administrative agencies, as I and my law firm does, it's our worst enemy, because we have to overcome this debt of deference that the courts are instructed by the Supreme Court under Chevron to pay to agencies as they interpret their own statutes, most of which are broad and provide something close to a blank check to the agency to regulate as it will. And earlier today, you heard in James Toronto's terrific talk his mention of the left-wing ideology that is so dominant in several different places. He identified, academia, of course, the media, Hollywood. He didn't mention the administrative state, but rest assured, and we're seeing it today with all of this resistance to change in the new direction of this administration within the agencies. There's the administrative state. There is something to this notion that there is a deep state, a bureaucracy that is just as thoroughly committed to these very liberal policies that they've been advancing, and very resistant to any effort to roll those back or take different directions.
Can I make just a point about the constitutional issues about the courts? Because they bring up a big point, and you all may not care about the Chevron doctrine and its particulars, but what's really important behind it is the control of the courts. And I just want to come back to Neil Gorsuch and why he's so important. Now, he was good. I was fine with him when I saw the picture of him with a gun and Justice Scalia and they gone hunting. I was like, that's good enough for me. I don't care what he thinks about anything else. But the thing that really brought him...
Yes, good.
I was like, why wasn't I invited? But the really important thing that brought him to the attention of people, I mean, there's almost 200 federal appeals judges. Why is Gorsuch different? He wrote a very important opinion calling for the end of these doctrines of judges letting the administrative state do what it wants without hardly any scrutiny, which is a very brave thing for a lower court judge to do when he's subject to appeal and being overturned by the Supreme Court. And so elevating him in particular to the Supreme Court as a clarion call that this administration is going to start putting people on the bench who are not going to let the administrative state run wild. Second thing I'll just point out is that the courts are scared to do this because they tried before. When we mentioned Woodrow Wilson, after Wilson and World War I was over, actually the administrative state got smaller. Coolidge, I thought, was a really great, unappreciated president. He really tried to restore the government back to its original vision. With the Great Depression, FDR then brought all of Wilson's bad ideas back. And the courts fought him for 4 years. The Supreme Court actually struck down most of what was called the first New Deal. And then what did FDR do? He came up with what's been called ever since the court packing plan, which would have given him 7 Supreme Court seats to fill to overturn these anti-New Deals. Now, FDR could never tell the truth that James was just talking about, presidents and people telling the truth. FDR, when he was asked why he was doing it, he said, there's so many justices over the age of 70 on the court. We need to add some younger ones to help them out, to do their opinions and work on their cases. So he just lied about why he wanted to do it. But thankfully, the Senate fought him off and refused to pass the bill to expand the court to 16 people. But the conservatives on the court gave up. They switched completely on all of their efforts to stop the New Deal and stop the administrative state. And we're still living under the same doctrines today. It's often called the switch in time that saved 9 because they gave up. The Supreme Court still got to remain 9 members. I think if the Trump administration is going to be remembered for anything in terms of constitutional politics 20 years from now, I hope there will be a similar effort to appoint judges who are actually going to take up the mantle of those justices from back then and try to figure out ways to bring the administrative state back within constitutional boundaries. But that means people like you and us have to support the right people for the courts, and that we have to be willing to take on big confirmation fights. I think Gorsuch was like a stroll in the park compared to what will happen if Justice Ginsburg retires and President Trump gets to appoint someone who would finally make Justice Kennedy's vote not matter anymore.
Hear, hear.
But you can tell how complex a problem this is, because it's not just the executive delegating power to agencies, it's the courts giving deference to the state. But I wonder too if it's also these liberal judges making up the law as they go along. Is that another factor here, Chuck?
It definitely is. And, as we speak about Chevron and deplore really the deference that it requires judges to give to agencies, that is not to say that the judges are the greatest thing going and they're, paragons necessarily of the rule of law. That is not what we have seen. There's one example after another of the Obamacare cases, to take 2 cases in recent point that I think everybody's familiar with, and I believe anyway, can readily be condemned as cases that simply have not upheld the rule of law. First, the rule of constitutional law in the first Obamacare case, and then second, the simple rule of statutory law. The statute itself allowed for these tax subsidies only to individuals who had purchased policies on an exchange established by the state, as clear could be, and a 5-member majority interpreted that to say, or an exchange established by the Department of HHS. I mean, it's so.
But that wasn't the only time they made up the law when it came to Obamacare, right?
Oh, no, not at all. And what it keyed off of was, again, an administrative agency, this time the IRS, interpreting those words established by a state to include an exchange established by the federal government. So, and this time, again, you had both the administrative agency and the courts really, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, ignoring the rule of law as it was in black and white in the statute itself. So no, that's not at all the only time the Supreme Court misinterpreted, I think, in the Obamacare case. The initial occasion was when the court upheld the individual mandate, which I mentioned earlier. Again, an unprecedented extension of federal power to order, American citizens to purchase a product against their will. This has never happened before in American history. And so that's the extent now, according to the Supreme Court, of Congress's power.
But everyone has heard of Obamacare and the excesses of it and how the administration misused the law to implement it and how the courts didn't interpret the law correctly. But there are so many other agencies in government that were abused during that period of time, not just the IRS, but Dean, I'm wondering if you can take us through a couple of examples of other instances during those years that you thought really expanded the power of this great blob of bureaucracy.
Sure. Some of these are sort of by way of illustrating when you get concentrated power in the agencies, it just leads to absurd results. Some of them almost sound funny, but they're consequential to the people involved. So you really have to keep that in mind. One of the things that the EEOCs, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has this doctrine of non-acquiescence, which means it continues to lose cases. It pushes a case, one particular kind of case, in one circuit after another. We have 13 different circuit courts in our country. They lose here, they bring the same case elsewhere, lose, they lose, they lose. They never seek guidance from the Supreme Court because they can keep losing in the circuit courts. But one case in particular that's just confounding that they keep losing, they keep bringing, is that it's disparate impact discrimination, meaning you lead to hiring too many young people. So it's discrimination on the part of businesses to recruit on college campuses, which I don't see how any agency could come to push a policy like that in this country where we're so much invested in education, to say that it's unlawful for businesses to recruit on college campuses. And that's a case they've brought here and here and here. I think now in 4 circuits they've lost this case. But you'll never get a definitive ruling on this from the Supreme Court because the winners can't appeal to the Supreme Court.
Chuck, you wanted to say?
Well, I just have what, at least to my mind, is a particularly insidious example of administrative excess and usurpation of power. And it's in my mind because I'm litigating a case against federal agencies because of it. And it also is among the chapters in the book, the one that I authored. But this is called Operation Choke Point. And, sometime in, early 2013, as the Obama's administration's second term was getting underway, suddenly a lot of businesses throughout the country, really, started losing their bank accounts. Their banks were terminating their bank accounts. And these businesses were perfectly law-abiding businesses, many regulated at the state level. But they were somewhat politically incorrect businesses, if you will. Tobacco sales, gun shops, guns and ammo, the payday lenders, the people who do short-term, low-dollar loans to people who are underbanked and unbanked. And that actually is my client, the payday lenders, who throughout the country started just abruptly finding that their bank accounts were being terminated. And, it wasn't because they were, any of them were particularly bad risk or any change had taken place in their industry. And in fact, the banks were expressing regret that they were terminating these longstanding, mutually beneficial banking relationships. So, what was going on? Well, the banking agencies, the FDIC, the OCC, and the Federal Reserve, all said, well, the Sergeant Schultz defense, we know nothing. And so they were expecting...
That's Sergeant, not George.
Right, Sergeant. So the explanation was that, well, for no good reason, payday lenders throughout the country were abruptly having their bank accounts terminated, notwithstanding the fact that the banks didn't want to do it. Well, as investigations and discovery started to reveal, in fact, the banks were pursuing something that they called Operation Choke Point. They targeted these very disfavored businesses, disfavored at least among those bureaucracies and in that administration, for choking off the financial oxygen necessary for any business to live. And they did it through a regulation, interpreting their own regulations in the very broad way, and then in backroom coercion sessions telling the banks that if you don't terminate these particular customers, well, you will come under the most brutal and severe bank examinations and audits that you can imagine. So the banks really had no choice. Now, think about that kind of backroom, insidious use of federal administrative power. Lawful entities, lawful businesses being targeted for extinction by this backroom coercion on regulated bodies. You see, none of these entities were actually directly regulated by the federal government. So the only way to exercise this death warrant, really, was to focus on the banks that had the power of life and death over these businesses.
Okay, we're going to do one last question that's depressing, and then we'll move on to the encouraging news. I think the apex of this administrative state has to be the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with it in the audience? Yeah, wow, look at that, okay. John,
A fellow named Cordray, ever heard of him?
Yep, the next governor of Ohio. John, can you just explain, and Chuck, I'm sure you're going to want to jump in here with your litigation, about why the CFPB is so unusual in terms of the way that it's run and why people should pay attention to it?
Two reasons. One, it's the most unconstitutionally structured agency I could think of in our history, actually. And then the second is what it's claimed the power to do. So in terms of structure, the CFPB is headed by a fellow named Richard Cordray. He's appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but cannot be removed by the president, essentially unless he commits a crime or some kind of grave abuse of authority. So it makes him almost impossible to remove him. The other way that Congress is supposed to hold agencies accountable is through the budget. But the CFPB gets most of its funding from its own activities, so it doesn't rely on a congressional appropriation of money. This is something that the framers would never have tolerated. James Madison, who I guess is the uncool partner with Alexander Hamilton these days, I don't know if Madison can rap, but that's the next Broadway play if you want to write it, is Madison, ! The musical. Anyway, Madison, Madison was actually challenged in the Virginia Convention, ratifying convention, by Patrick Henry, actually, who was a great critic of the Constitution. He said, "You've created a gigantic state. It's going to run roughshod over our liberties." And Madison said, as long as Congress has the power of the purse, the people's liberties will be safe. The CFPB is not under the control of Congress's power of the purse. It can do whatever it wants. I think it built some outrageous headquarters in Washington, D.C. that Congress never could control. But the second thing that's even worse about the CFPB, I think, is that it claims the right to regulate anything involving consumers and money. So anything. So they're, not only are they responsible for all the extra pages in your credit card bill telling you all the things about interest rates, which any adult, I hope, would know, but they've also done things like try to regulate auto loan practices, which Congress and the statute said it couldn't do, and then engage in this really crazy thing. They tried to determine whether auto lenders were discriminating by race in the way they were giving out loans. They couldn't tell the race of the people on the records who were getting loans from these auto dealers. So they just assumed certain last names were black names and certain names were white names. And then they came out with a huge study saying, oh, auto lenders don't give out to blacks because Johnson is a black name and Ross is a white name. I wish it could make that up. It's just
That's
the most
not fake
ridiculous thing I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be flatly unconstitutional. Can you imagine if Trump's tweeted, everyone named Johnson in the country must be black. I'm ordering the government to investigate. I think I wish this were an aberration, but this is just the administrative state just reaching its highest crescendo. Needless to say, it was thought up by the Democrats' next presidential candidate, Elizabeth Warren, who I hope and pray will be the Democrats' next candidate.
Yeah, just to add to that, to give you an idea of, I guess, the arrogance that this kind of independence from all types of accountability and official control can breed. In an oversight hearing, Mr. Cordray was testifying in the House, and it came under quite a bit of criticism because of this really opulent headquarters that they were building using the money that they could simply requisition from the Federal Reserve. They have this blank check, really, to fund their regulatory activities, as John has just said. But Mr. Cordray, I guess in light of that fact, actually asked one of the congressmen, his congresswoman, asking him pointed questions, what difference does it make to you how much we spend?
I think
He literally asked that.
He took that line from Hillary, I think. So this is very depressing. So just to wrap up the negative part here. So
You're not coming to me for the
yeah, well, I'm
positive
coming to
part.
you right now for the really bad stuff. So how much does this all cost us, and what kind of toll does this take? Do you have any numbers?
Well, yeah, I have a few statistics, and John mentioned at the outset that nobody really knows the size of this, and that's very troubling. So some of these are guesses by economists who study these things, the impact of these things. By the way, the example John just mentioned resulted in a $98 million settlement with the bank. And they did run the test. They tried. The only reason they caught this was because they tried to disperse these funds, and confused people were saying, "I'm not a minority. I guess I'm not entitled to this." They tried to return the funds. So that's the way this was discovered, for trying to get rid of the $98 million. But there's one study that estimates that the average cost to the average family per year for the federal regulatory regime is $15,000.
Really?
You could do a lot with $15,000. But I think one thing that's even more telling, that so much more of the law gets made by administrative agencies than by Congress. It's 80,000 pages to some small number of statutes. And a good example is the Dodd-Frank bill, which birthed the CFPB. It's one statute, and it requires 390 rulemakings by the agencies. So it's Congress saying, let's improve things, and then agencies 390 different ways saying we're going to do this.
So,
and there's one agency in particular called ACUS. It's the Administrative Conference of the United States. They don't call it an agency, they just call it the conference. But it's supposed to sort of superintend and oversee all the other agencies. And they issued a report earlier this decade saying they couldn't determine how many agencies there were. Not how many rules there were. And we haven't even talked about the sub-regulatory guidance yet. But not how many rules. They don't know how many agencies there are, and they're in charge.
okay, we really need to turn to some good news. Maybe we should, maybe if we could start with Congress where we began. Chuck, there's a tool now that Congress is using to get rid of regulations. I think it's known as the CRA. What is that? How powerful is it? How important is it?
Well, I think you're talking about the Regulatory Review Act.
The Congressional Review Act, yeah.
And Dean is actually.
Oh, Dean,
our
okay,
resi-
we'll go
he's
to
our
Dean, and then
resident
we'll come back to you
expert
on another
Well,
topic.
so the Congressional Review Act was passed 21 years ago now, and it has been used once before the Trump administration. But basically what it allows Congress to review any major rule, and major rule is defined by the agency, so that's a bit of leaving a bit of the power in the agencies in the first instance. But any major rule an agency has passed within the last 60 days of Congress, 60 congressional calendar days, Congress can take that up and in an expedited process give it a big thumbs down, and the rule is gone forever. The agency can no longer even pass a rule substantially similar to that rule. So it is a great mechanism that allows Congress to reach back 60 days and revoke rules, essentially, and prevent rules from being made in the future in that specific area. It's been used once before Trump. It's been used over a dozen times since President Trump was elected, because now you have a sort of magic moment where you have a House and a Senate and an executive all controlled by the same party who are inclined to deregulate. And that's the first time this has really happened since the Congressional Review Act has been passed. There is one interesting theory and interpretation of the Congressional Review Act that says that 60 days can be extended back to a time when it doesn't begin to run, that is. The 60-day clock doesn't begin to run until the agency advises Congress of the passage, the adoption of the regulation, which they never do. So there's this theory that Congress could reach back as far as 21 years and essentially obliterate any major rule that has been passed. That's a political one.
Yeah.
So that would be a big political question.
And what has Trump done? Is his main achievement in this area to appoint cabinet members that are kind of reining in this state that you've talked about, John? Is that his main contribution?
Yes, I think that there are a lot of things. I mean, Congress is much at fault in its effort to escape accountability. But I agree. I think now the onus is on the president. And President Trump campaigned on a platform of not being PC. I very much agree with James's reading that a lot of people voted for him because they just don't like political correctness. And I live in the People's Republic of Berkeley, so I've had it up to here with political. I can't even think in a non-PC way anymore. I've lived there so long. But thank you for giving me the invitation to get out of the jurisdiction of the Republic for one day.
Hey, John, I'm from Brooklyn, so I think we cover the liberal parts of the country.
Sorry for the little rant. But the other thing he campaigned on was, remember, freeing up private enterprise and personal individual freedom from government. And there are a few things President Trump could do. One thing he's done, which is a very promising sign, is there's this little office in the executive office of the president under the Office of Management and Budget called OIRA. That little agency has the right to stop any new regulation if the costs exceed the benefits, which you would think would be common sense. But there are actually a lot of agencies which want to impose regulations where the costs do exceed the benefits. So now he just put into office someone there named Naomi Rao, who the editorial page is written about, who I've been friends with her for 20 years. I won't tell you what she thinks, but I can say she clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. So that to me is a good sign that she'll have the right view about the administrative state and what to do about. The second thing, and this is more aggressive, and perhaps I might disagree with my fellow panelists. You might remember at the end of his administration, President Obama claimed the right not to enforce any of the immigration laws, even though the president's primary constitutional duty, aside from protecting the country from attack, is enforcing the laws. Faithfully executing the laws is what the Constitution says. But President Obama said, well, I don't feel like enforcing these immigration laws because I don't like them. Well, now that President Trump is in power, I think it's worth putting the shoe on the other foot and teaching liberals what happens when a conservative doesn't want to enforce any laws. So I think President Trump could say, I'm not enforcing any regulations enacted under the Obama administration. I'm just going to send them all back to 2008. So, right, if you want to, President Obama said, this little minnow that's not allowed to, that has to swim in the Sacramento River Delta and requires us to shut off all water to the Central Valley and kill thousands of almond trees, right? That's what Trump could say, go ahead, take the water. I'm not going to enforce anything against you. I think President Trump should do that for as many years as the Obama administration refused to enforce immigration laws.
Well,
Wait,
hey,
wait,
hang on,
wait,
hey,
wait, wait,
yeah, hang on.
I knew it was going to get someone going.
I love the way that sounds too, but there's a rule of law here, guys, okay? And there's a way that Trump and Scott Pruitt at EPA can do this. They get to the same place, takes a little more time. You have to comply with the laws that Congress has legitimately passed, the Administrative Procedure Act, and it requires that you jump through some hoops. Well, we can get to the same place, let's do that. Let's do that. And I just want to add as well, in addition to the importance of having Scott Pruitt's in the cabinet and Jeff Sessions and other, very solid conservatives, freedom-loving, constitution-loving, rule of law-loving patriots, is the judicial process. John's already mentioned that. And one thing that cheers me most about this administration is the seriousness of purpose that it has to ensure that Gorsuch-like nominees are advanced for Senate confirmation throughout the country. All 13 of the Court of Appeals, the District Court, and I've just been really, really impressed by how careful and how thoroughgoing this administration has been in judicial selection. And that's something I've been...
Although they've missed 3 important possible nominees, I have to say.
There are some people in the queue, John.
You-
Actually, maybe 2. I'm an advocate. I would rather, talk to damn fools than listen to them.
Don't go on CNN.
So, on the rule of law, I'm with Chuck more than John. But one important caveat, I think that anything that was adopted sort of by some infirm or illicit means can be undone by the same means. I think that's fair enough. So if President Obama signed an executive order that overreached the natural bounds of an executive order, that can be undone with an executive order.
Sure.
So I'm fine with that.
President Obama has a pen also,
Yeah.
and a phone.
One thing that we haven't talked about is Congress's ability or interest in taking back the legislative power that it delegated, or even enforcing its will when agencies go awry. Chuck mentioned how cavalier Richard Cordray was when he was asked a question. Why is Congress unable to enforce its will, and will they ever take back their original function in the Constitution?
That's a great question, and the courts are implicit there too, because Congress delegates its authority for the reasons John mentioned. The incentives are that they can claim credit for passing the Dodd-Frank Act and fixing financial services, but when it comes to doing absurd implementation of the act, they can disclaim things. And to their constituent, I'm going to write a nasty letter to Richard Cordray. We'll get to the bottom of this, and that's the end of that. So I think, the founders assumed that the 3 branches would assert their power to the maximum possible. And in doing that, each branch would check the other branch. And Congress has failed to assert its power here. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think groups like this can whet their appetite for taking back their power. I think it almost feels to me that the power of Congress now is being a congressman. And so their incentives run precisely towards getting reelected. Not towards passing good law, not towards exercising legislative power. It's towards getting reelected.
Chuck?
There are some very serious men and women in Congress right now, though.
Oh, yes. No, there are some bright spots.
Who are leading very serious efforts to corral the administrative state. Lots of very important measures under consideration, including one that would eliminate this Chevron deference we were talking about earlier.
Right.
So there's the possibility of important reforms, I think.
And there's a Reins Act, which would,
Right.
instead of allowing Congress to revoke a major rule, would require Congress to approve every major rule before it goes into effect. Otherwise, it doesn't go into effect.
I want to leave time for questions so the audience can ask their own. But just before we do, I just want to ask all three gentlemen on the panel, are you optimistic that Trump is going to be able to enact real change to shrink this administrative state, to bring it to heel? Or is this just, in your view, kind of a temporary reprieve? You first, Chuck.
I'm prayerful. Let me just say that.
Dean?
I'm actually optimistic. I think when you add up sort of a renewed interest in Congress, the renewed interest in Chevron deference in the judiciary, and the appointments at all levels that President Trump has made, and the fact that John mentioned, we have a president who was elected on a deregulatory platform. That, to me, shows a national appetite that things need to be changed. So I'm pretty optimistic.
I think the best Trump can do is to just stop it from growing. So I'm just reminded of President Reagan. Chuck served in the administration, and he's probably the most principled, well-known deregulatory president in our history. And if you go back and look, we've got studies now of what happened under his administration, and the best Reagan could do with a cooperative bipartisan Congress was just to freeze the growth of the administrative state for 8 years. He's the only president who's even been able to get it to stop growing. So I think if Trump can just get it to stop, then I think that's actually quite a victory for him. But it would have to be the next president after that who we elect who could start shrinking it.
Right. Which makes activism in your community so important, as Jennifer said. We're going to go to Q&A. Please, your name and a question. And if you don't ask a question and you start to give a speech, I'm going to brutally cut you off. So we're going to start over here on the right. Name and question, please.
Karen Corns, Greeley, Colorado. How can we encourage Senator Grassley to bring up these nominees for consideration?
John?
Yeah.
Chuck?
Well, by encouraging Senator Grassley to do that. Seriously, that is a very good point. I think, I don't want to be too harshly critical of Senator Grassley. He's dealing with some encrusted Senate traditions and things like the so-called blue slip prerogatives that senators claim, and there's very serious, excuse me, very serious re-examination of some of those prerogatives, senatorial prerogatives that clog this process and slow it down. But not long ago, Senator Grassley, I think, made a very firm statement about moving the judicial nominees forward, and that'll be the first order of business, and everything else is going to take a back seat. I really do think he recognizes the essential nature of getting these judges, these vacancies filled with Trump nominees.
Over here on the left, name and question, please.
Hey, my name is Chris Cole. The panel kind of reminded me of a particularly formative day in my life. And I'm not sure what I was doing or why I was looking at the bottom of my desk chair.
There's
but
a question here, right?
Yeah, oh, don't worry.
Okay.
There was a, what? Okay, I got it, don't worry. There was a sticker on the bottom and it said, approved by the Bureau, or the California Bureau of Home Furnishings. And that was a really formative day in my life. And the question comes now. I'm wondering to what degree are states adopting this model of administration, and isn't that at least marginally more constitutional?
Great question.
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. The states, we like to think of state power being exercised in a better way at the state level. Certainly they have more power. They have the police power, so they have more legitimate power. But they're not necessarily doing things the best way possible. And I can cite a couple examples. One, recent studies show that 24% of the people in this country have a license to do their job. So you need a state or local government granted license to be a florist in Louisiana, inexplicably, and a license to braid hair in Utah, and it's only to protect the entrenched business people there. There's an ordinance in San Francisco that forbids the erection of a building that casts a shadow on a public park. And a law school, the Hastings Law School, proposed a building. They started building it and then found out it would cast a shadow for 3 minutes a day, for 6 feet, a 6-foot shadow, into the parking lot of a public park. For 1 day a year on June 21st. So they had to carve out the top floor of that building and make a little patio up there or something so the sun could come through. So there are absurdities at every level.
Let me just say, first of all, we deserve it. Living in California, this is the beauty of the framer
Can't disagree with that.
Yeah, this is the beauty of the framer system, is that we have different states and we can have different attitudes to government power. And I live in the worst state in the country, if not California. I mean, it's a joke how far government regulation goes. But there's an ocean, which you don't have in Colorado. And, the temperature's nice, and there's a lot of hippies to make me coffee and tea and the best food in the world. So we have a lot of government taxes and we have a lot of regulations, but the secret of the system is that you as citizens get to choose where you want to live. And so if you don't like it in California, then you can move to Colorado, and you don't have to smoke marijuana, you can just get it secondhand from everybody else. But in order for that to work, yeah, don't send people from California to here. But for that to work, you have to have competition amongst the states. And I just want to bring it back to the original point Mary made at the beginning. If the federal government expands its power too much, it suppresses that competition and enforces a uniformity on all of us that prevents us from having that choice so that you could live in to me, Colorado seems like free market paradise compared to where I live, but if the federal government starts telling all of us what to do, then we don't have that choice anymore. There's no more competition amongst the states.
And not only can we as individuals live where we want, thankfully, in this federal system we have, federalism, but businesses can locate where they want. And you may all remember when the NLRB tried to prevent Boeing from moving a plant from a state where the labor laws were more to the NLRB's liking than to South Carolina. Fortunately, that was one of the administrative actions that did not prevail. But as long as we are free to move, the states are free to compete among themselves for our interests and our tax dollars.
Over here in the back, name and question, please.
Hi, my name is Helen. I have 2 questions. The first one is regarding the recent Trinity Church decision. How do you think that's going to impact other states' Blaine Amendment-related lawsuit, especially we have one in Colorado? And my second question is specific to Professor Yu. Since you live in the leftist zip code in the whole nation, how does your interaction with your students, do they give your nightmare or hope to the future of our country?
So let me answer the second question, and someone else can.
Take the first.
So, I often get this question: what's it like to be a conservative living in Berkeley? So usually I tell my students it's like being West Berlin in the Cold War, which totally goes over their head. They have no idea. Like, oh, West Berlin, that's just next to East Berlin. Give me an A. Actually, we actually don't give A's because that's seen as harsh and judgmental. We just give honors and pass. Can I tell more terrible stories of what we do at Berkeley? We find exams so stressful. I'm not making any of this up. That we we at our own the university expense provide pets for the students to pet and stroke while they're taking exams. It's not even a tough one.
John, do you get those while you're grading exams?
No, because I start kicking things when I grade exams. Also, I've heard rumors that half the students claim some kind of mental illness during exam time because that gives you, under the Americans with Disability Act, something like twice as much time on the exam to claim that you have some kind of handicap. So I could go on and on. But, ask me about it at cocktails when I will be handicapping myself with liquor. So anyway, so I just basically say, Berkeley, in a way, is no worse than University of Colorado, Boulder, or any of the elite universities. They're all, as James was pointing out with his point about the liberalism and sort of suffocating mindset of our cultural institutions, what I've seen going around to other universities is Berkeley is actually just as bad as all the other top schools. There's no top university that's not liberal like Berkeley is now. Right. But anyway, so I tell my students, like, I'm West Berlin. They're like, what's West Berlin? I said, well, once upon a time, the communists controlled East Germany, and there was this little city, West Berlin, and it was a shining symbol of capitalism and democracy, surrounded by a sea of commies. So that's me. I don't even remember the first question.
So, Helen's first question was on, I believe, the issue of religious liberty, which is.
Oh yeah, the Blaine Amendment is over.
Yeah.
In this state, I mean, the Trinity Lutheran made it clear these Blaine. For those who don't know, the Blaine Amendment says, it basically forbids public funds from eventually reaching a religious institution. They were passed almost all at the same time, the late 19th century, out of under the suggestion of Senator Blaine, who almost became president, and it was done out of fear of Catholic immigration into the United States. I think after Trinity Lutheran is a case where a Lutheran church wanted to take advantage of I don't even know why a state would do this, a grant program to take tires and recycle the rubber and surface playgrounds with it. And why government is doing this at all is it in Missouri, I guess the case came out of, right? Missouri? Got me. Anyway, so the state said, well, your church, you can't do it, even though we'll let any other school take these funds. The Supreme Court said you cannot discriminate against religious institutions when they participate in freely available government programs. I think that really sounds a death knell for the Blaine Amendment. It's going to take people like Chuck, who I hope make a lot of money on government fees on doing this. They're going to have to chip away at the Blaine Amendment on program after program, state by state, but eventually I think they'll all be held unconstitutional.
And if you want to learn more, there are some great chapters in the book about religious liberty and how the administrative state has started to kind of crush religious liberty, so I'd refer you to those. In the back, name and question, please.
Roger Burton, currently from Las Vegas. John, to follow up a little bit on the question before, with your opinions on conservatism, how or do you face opposition on campus for presenting your conservative opinions, because it could in fact incite a riot based on the...
I've incited riots, don't get me wrong.
But do you face problems with that in classes?
Yeah, I do a lot, but I don't know. I got to say, I'm a first-generation immigrant from, at the time, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, and I got to come here and become a professor. I can't help but be happy every day of my life, because if the United States did not intervene in the Korean War, I would be in a rice paddy right now, or building nuclear weapons. I'm so happy to be, even in Berkeley, I'm happy to be around. So, so I don't take it too seriously. But I will say, like, every day at the beginning of a class, these people from the Vietnam War era who are still around have a protest in front of the law school. I got to one story. So there's about 20 of them, and they have this like 5-foot-high paper mache head of me. And now it's quite racist in the way it's drawn, but they can't be racist. But I want to know, what are they doing with that head the other 364 days of the year? Does he keep it in his bedroom and like polish it and keep it clean? That really disturbs me. What goes on? But this is the kind of things that occur to me when I watch the protest. So yeah, there are a lot of protests, but it's mostly driven from outsiders. The laws, I got to say, we could go on and on about how crazy campuses are, maybe in other panels. I got to say, in most university campuses, the law schools are somewhat immune from the insanity because we teach there are two sides to every case. And so we always treat with respect the other side's arguments, even when we disagree with them, because a good lawyer like Chuck, Dean and I don't do litigation, but Chuck is good because if you pay him $2,000 an hour, he'll argue whatever you want. So Chuck, actually, I'm sorry, I actually just gave you a 50% discount. But You know, my job is, and I also tell my students, 50% of the federal judiciary was appointed by conservatives. You cannot go up in court and say, you have to fine for my client because justice requires it, right? You have to speak the vocabulary of a conservative judge. And so, but on the other parts of campus, it's insane. I mean, we had, you know, riots that almost burnt down the student center to stop a conservative speaker, and we actually had to ban Ann Coulter from coming onto campus, which is a terrible thing because these people wanted to cause a riot. So I really worry about free speech on our campus. It's something that's really beyond the power of federal government. I think it's something that communities have to start taking charge of again, because if the young people start to have this view that there are only certain acceptable points of view, then, you know, we're really in deep trouble. So to try to take a stand of it, I stick around on campus instead of you know, moving to Florida, Texas, where I belong.
There's another great chapter in the book actually on campus free speech, which you can also check out. We're running out of time. I think I have time for one more question. Just back here, name and question, please. We're going to try to stay on time.
Robert Gochi from the worst state in the Union, Illinois.
Oh.
No opportunity, high taxes, and more regulations. I have a question for the panel. Jeff Sessions has 1,000 which worse, not civil servant employees before Barack Obama passed him in to be in civil service. Is there any way that Jeff Sessions can get rid of these civil servants, because obviously they've been there less than a year, and get them back into appointed positions so there's some control over them?
Gentlemen?
Well, let me start by saying I think one of the big problems in the federal government are the civil service laws that allow so many people to continue to serve and makes it so difficult to get rid of people who aren't performing. After having said that, I will say that I know a lot of people who work for the federal government. I know some of them are on the right, most of them are on the left. They're not terrible people. They're just trying to do their job. And the only tools they have is to regulate and to enforce. So that's what they do. And the problem is they do it too well. Burrowing in is sort of the thing you're describing there, where a political appointee gets a career slot and lives in the federal government forever. That's a problem that I don't think we have a quick answer to. I would say in terms of what Attorney General Sessions and others need to do is just stay as vigilant as possible and be skeptical and know who they're dealing with when they're dealing with career staff. And they're woefully outnumbered in the Department of Justice and elsewhere, even more so in other agencies.
Great. I think, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I'd encourage you all to go to the book signing afterwards. Please join me in thanking this terrific panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. What fun this has been.